We assume that you all know that this is about. We assume that you have the papers in front of you, which give you the agenda for the morning. There is one addition, which is we're very lucky in a couple of respects, that Ken Monahan of the National Association of Manufacturers, the new, relatively new, I'm not sure quite when he joined, Director for International Trade there, has joined the panel. We're just delighted that they're here. I always like to see NAM on a panel. If only because they're members, but also because they've always got something to say and they're so darn important. The other thing I'd like to note is that this morning we're doing something new. We're webcasting this event. And it may be that there will be a question or two which Dave Bond will have to deal with. That'll come through, and we welcome those that way. Because we are webcasting it and not everybody who will be watching this knows us, I just wanted to say a very brief word about the Global Business Dialogue, which I represent. We're kind of a hybrid organization. We've been doing events like this on trade policy since we were started in 2000. We're hybrid in the sense that we're an association. We have members, companies, embassies, associations like the National Pork Producers Council. But we don't take collective positions. In that sense, we're more like a think tank, but we don't have a stable of scholars. Our intellectual content comes from our members, friends with expertise, and a little from the staff. Okay, enough of what I needed to get through. What you're all waiting for is the part that Dave Bond will preside over. David Bond's been a partner with White & Case since 1993. In that time, he's worked on a range of trade issues, but I notice a fair number on agriculture, and he's a real expert on the cool issue. So I think he can give us some background on the issue as well as introducing the speakers and carrying this discussion forward. Dave, it's yours.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning. It's been about 6 years since Canada and Mexico requested the initial panel to review whether COOL was WTO consistent with the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade. In June of 2013, the appellate body confirmed the initial panel determination that COOL is WTO inconsistent. The U.S. was then given until May of 2013 to take some action to bring itself into compliance with the appellate body's findings. In May 2013, USDA issued its amended COOL regulations, ostensibly to bring the United States into compliance. Mexico and Canada appealed that ruling, taking the case back to the WTO before a compliance panel. The compliance panel found that far from bringing the United States into compliance, it had the opposite effect of making the situation worse, that the new COOL rules, which required retailers to label meat products at the retail level with information with respect to where the meat was born, raised, and slaughtered, had a more onerous, a more negative effect on the meat production and distribution chain. Just a few weeks ago, in early May, the appellate body affirmed that ruling, and so where we stand now is that COOL has been definitively determined to be WTO inconsistent. Tomorrow, Canada and Mexico will seek authorization from the dispute settlement body in Geneva to retaliate against the United States for its failure to bring COOL into compliance. Canada has requested about $2.4 billion a year in increased tariffs to punish the United States. It appears that Canada intends to impose those tariffs on a range of products, including beef, pork, apples, rice, maple syrup, pasta, and wine. Mexico, for its part, has requested authorization to suspend about $713 million a year in tariff concessions. Mexico hasn't yet, as far as I'm aware, identified the particular products that it intends to retaliate against. But in total, we're talking about $3.2 billion a year in additional tariffs on U.S. products being exported to our NAFTA partners. The duties will obviously place U.S. producers and the workers that manufacture covered products at a great competitive disadvantage, both with respect to domestically produced products in Canada and Mexico, but also with respect to imports from other countries. The U.S. will have the opportunity to object to the retaliation proposed by Mexico and Canada, and if it does, there'll be an arbitration. According to the applicable WTO rules, as well as the sequencing agreement that Mexico, Canada, and the United States entered into with respect to this particular dispute, that arbitration process should take 60 days. So we're looking at the possibility of retaliation beginning in late August. As Judge mentioned, in response to the threat of retaliation, the House has recently voted to repeal COOL, so the ball is now in the Senate's court. There have been reports that some in the Senate intend to propose some other sort of modification to COOL, something sort of retaliation, which strikes me as a very risky approach. Because once the WTO authorizes Canada and Mexico to retaliate, which it unquestionably will, there's only going to be two ways to stop the retaliation. One is that the United States takes steps that make Mexico and Canada happy so that they choose to stop retaliating. The second option would be for the United States to start its own new WTO appeal to force Mexico and Canada to remove their retaliation. Such a second appeal would take years, most likely, to complete. And while that second appeal was going on, the retaliation would remain in place with the detrimental effects that I mentioned to U.S. exports to Canada and Mexico. So we don't have a whole lot of room to maneuver. It seems to me that to the extent that we had leverage, we lost it during our original opportunity to comply. At this point, our option is to make Mexico and Canada happy or to face the possibility of bringing our own second WTO dispute. So with that backdrop, I want to call on our panelists to provide their perspectives. We're going to ask that you hold your questions, please, until all of the panelists have spoken, and we'll do a single round of Q&A with all the panelists. So our first panelist is Ken Smith. I'm sure many of you know Ken. Ken heads the Trade and NAFTA office of Mexico's Ministry of Economy. Prior to coming to D.C. in that position, he was the Coordinator General for International Affairs at SAGARPA, which is the Mexican Ministry of Agriculture. Ken?
Thank you very much, David. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to first of all thank the Global Business Dialogue and the National Pork Producers Council for the opportunity to come here to be with you today and share Mexico's viewpoint on COOL and where we stand on this issue. Now, one of the most important achievements of the North American Free Trade Agreement has been the consolidation and strengthening of supply chains throughout the region. Now, one often hears about supply chain integration in sectors such as automotive, electronic, and increasingly today in aerospace and biotechnologies between our countries. However, the same is true for the agricultural sector, and in particular in the livestock and meat industries. Over the years, Mexico and the U.S. have greatly integrated the trade in live cattle and meat products to the benefit of consumers in both countries. The story begins where U.S. genetics are brought into Mexico, and the newly born calves are exported to the U.S. as live cattle at a young age. They are then fed, raised, and slaughtered in the U.S., and the resulting beef products are packed for domestic consumption or are exported to Mexico or third markets. Now, this integration model has worked for decades and has been strengthened by the duty-free environment created by the NAFTA. The truth is that we are producing jointly live cattle and beef products, and in the case of Canada, hogs and pork as well, for consumption in our region, but also in the households and restaurants of Japan and Korea and many other countries. It is a model that has worked. Now, our integrated market was disrupted by the COOL provisions contained in the 2002 and then 2009 Farm Bill that established the labeling requirements forcing U.S. processing plants and ranchers to segregate the cattle in order to comply with the measure. USDA has acknowledged that COOL has no measurable consumer benefits, and on the contrary, it imposes significant costs associated with the label. USDA informed the U.S. Congress, in fact, in April, that the cost of establishing obligatory requirements for COOL on meat products outweighed the benefits. COOL has harmed and seriously impacted the cattle and beef industry in North America. Over the years, we have exhausted all possible alternatives that would help the U.S. to bring its measure to compliance without success. And as David mentioned, on May 18th, the appellate body of the World Trade Organization published the compliance panel report regarding the case of country of origin labeling. This decision confirms that the amended cool measure is not in compliance with U.S. international obligations under the WTO, and that the discrimination effect remains in place for Canadian and Mexican livestock. Mexico and Canada, in turn, requested on June 4th an extraordinary meeting of the WTO dispute settlement body, and this will be held on June 17th, tomorrow. Mexico originally estimated that the impact of the cool measure amounted to $653 million annually, but last Friday we filed a correction which increases the amount to $713 million. This, combined with the $2.4 billion that Canada has estimated, makes this one of the largest retaliation amounts recorded. And it is particularly troublesome the fact that it is both Canada and Mexico, two of the most important trading partners of the U.S., that are bringing this claim to the WTO. Now, if the U.S. were to appeal the retaliatory amount presented by Mexico and Canada, a WTO arbitration could issue the final decision as early as August, and retaliation could begin then. So the issue is imminent. Mexico has imposed similar measures in the past. You may recall the cross-border trucking dispute, which started in 1995, as well as the Byrd Amendment in 2001. Regarding the former, Mexico raised tariffs on 89 different U.S. goods, ranging from agricultural products to jewelry, and valued at $2.4 billion. We applaud Congressman Conaway's bill to repeal cool and its overwhelming approval in the House of Representatives, where it received 300 votes in favor. We commend the House for understanding the importance of restoring the balance of a fully integrated market for cattle and beef between Mexico and the U.S. We are hopeful now that the U.S. Senate will take the necessary steps to fully eliminate the discriminatory effect of cool and avoid an imminent retaliation for its most important trading partners. Mexico looks forward to working closely with the United States in order to return to the free trade environment that has generated great benefits for both of our countries. We have, between Mexico and the U.S., built a trade relationship in the agricultural sector that now amounts to $40 billion, 19.5 of which are U.S. exports of agricultural products into Mexico. We want to continue and to strengthen free trade in agricultural products and in all the products that are covered by the NAFTA. So we believe that the time for action, for congressional action in the Senate, is now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken. Our second speaker is John Masswohl. John is the Director of Government and International Relations with the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. He's been with the association since 2004. And prior to that, he worked with the Canadian government, including a stint at the Canadian Embassy between 2001 and 2004 here in Washington, D.C. John?
Great. Thank you, David. Well, I guess from my perspective, David and Ken have done the hard part explaining, why this matters and the legal aspects and how we've got here. I'm looking a bit forward in terms of where are we going on this. And so from our perspective, from the Canadian cattle producers, we're ready for this issue to be fixed, I think, to put it mildly. But I think an important thing to keep in mind is we're not desperate. We want the right fix. We're not looking for just any compromise, any kind of middle path. If you think about it now, we're 7 years into this issue. We've spent as an organization over $3.25 million of our producers' checkoff money on legal fees and advocacy to fight this thing. It's cost our producers, just from the cattle side, cattle and hogs, over $3 billion Canadian per year for the last couple of years, since the May 13 when USDA made this worse instead of fixing it. So we haven't come through all of this just to settle for half a loaf at this point. We very much support what was passed in the House last week, which is to repeal it. We're not proposing any compromise. We're not seeking a negotiation. There's not a whole lot of time, as David I think quite rightly outlined, there's a process at the WTO which is leading towards retaliation. There's not a lot of time there. And, you know, you all know what it takes to generate ideas in this town and pass them and come up with good policies. And, you know, what people propose isn't always necessarily what ends up happening. So I would also agree with the comment that if the Senate thinks that there's a middle path on this, that's a very risky strategy to move forward. That timeline that was outlined is what we're expecting. We're expecting that before the end of this summer, that we will be authorized to put tariffs on you know, whatever number the WTO authorizes. We're looking for over 3 billion Canadian dollars. And once they authorize that, I think a very important point is the burden of proof of where does that switch, where does that lie? Because once they authorize that, then the decisions will be made by Canada and by Mexico in terms of when the tariffs go on, what products will they go on, what will the level of tariffs be, all those sorts of things. So we're making those decisions. You know, now I'm not in government. I don't ultimately make those decisions, but we've been cooperating very closely with our hog colleagues in Canada, with the government folks, with all the various different departments, and everything I see is there's a lot of resolve up there to do this thing. We've got the Minister of Agriculture, the Minister of Trade, the Minister of Finance. The Prime Minister himself has said that they want this thing fixed and they're prepared to retaliate if necessary. You know, in terms of what's on the list, if you haven't seen the list, it's a broad list. It has, yes, beef and pork on it. It has other agriculture products. It has fruits and vegetables and wine and some distilled beverages. Whiskey, I believe, is on there. Cakes and cookies. But it also has things from outside of agriculture. There's furniture. I believe there's some steel tubing, mattresses. So it's a broad list. It's a list that was designed to get some attention. You know, we've looked at who are where are the congressional districts, where are the states that have tended to support COOL, the senators and congressmen that have tended to support COOL, and we've looked at products that are made in those areas. You know, again, it's not something we want to have to do, but the key word is we have to do it. If it gets to the point where Canada is authorized to retaliate and the Congress has not passed something that's acceptable to us, we will have to retaliate. This is broader than just this issue. This is about trade policy and the rule of law. And if a country, I think the United States would be in the same position if the shoe was on the other foot. If a country is restricting your trade and you've gone through the process and you've spent several years to do it, at the end of it, you have to retaliate if there is not an acceptable solution. So that's where we're at. In terms of the solution that we're seeking, the segregation of imported livestock has to end. For us, this is not about consumer information. This is about costs and burden in the system and buying and handling and managing livestock, whether it's feedlots that buy them, whether it's packing facilities that buy them. This rule has created a lot of burden, a lot of cost. For us, it's over $100 per head on every animal. And we need that to go away. We can't see that there's any way other than repealing this to make that happen. We've heard various suggestions. None of them achieve the elimination of the segregation. So like I said, we're not proposing something. We're not here to make suggestions for a compromise. We're here to seek the repeal. So I think maybe with that, we'll leave it for the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Our next speaker is Ken Monahan. Ken is the Director of Trade Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. He works heavily on TPP, TPA, and TTIP issues, like a lot of us, as well as WTO negotiations and disputes. Prior to that, he was a senior policy analyst with Bloomberg Government, and before that, he worked as an economist with the Department of Commerce. So, Ken.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here today. I'm not sure what else I can say that hasn't been said, but I will say it maybe from the manufacturing perspective. The National Association of Manufacturers, we're the largest industrial trade association and voice for more than 12 million women and men who make things in America. Manufacturing in the U.S. supports more than 17 million jobs, and in 2014, U.S. manufacturing output reached a record of nearly $2.1 trillion. The United States' continued failure to bring the country of origin labeling rules for muscle cuts of meat into compliance with its WTO obligations is threatening U.S. manufactured goods exports to our two largest trading partners, Canada and Mexico. The cool rules, which were put in place more than 6 years ago, have now been found to be out of compliance with WTO obligations with the United States that the United States itself helped create not just once, but now 4 times. With the threat of retaliation looming for our nation's manufacturers, we in the Cool Reform Coalition urge that Congress move quickly to bring the U.S. into compliance with its international obligations. We strongly supported the bill passed by the House last week by an overwhelming margin, 300 votes in support, to repeal these WTO inconsistent cool provisions. By doing so, the House took a critical first step toward bringing the United States back into compliance with these international obligations regarding cool after years of inaction, but there's still much work to be done to guarantee a solution that protects manufacturing jobs. With manufacturers targeted for retaliation from our two largest trading partners, it's now the time for the Senate to pass legislation that can avoid retaliation. The stakes are huge. Canada and Mexico are by far the United States' largest export markets, purchasing a record $485 billion in manufactured goods in 2014. And those exports supported millions of U.S. jobs. WTO authorized retaliation by two of these critical U.S. trading partners would result in more than $3 billion in annual tariffs affecting multiple sectors of the U.S. economy, threatening the livelihoods of American families, including not just agricultural products again, but also manufacturing products. Canada has put forward a proposed retaliatory list which includes many manufacturing goods, including steel pipes, heating appliance parts, office swivel chairs, wooden furniture, and mattresses. Now, as you've heard, Mexico has not yet put forth its own set of products for its retaliation list, but manufacturers have already witnessed firsthand Mexican retaliation in the trucking case that was mentioning earlier. Mexico imposed tariffs as high as 45% on 99 products, resulted in lost sales and lost jobs. Manufactured goods listed on Mexico's trucking retaliation list included office equipment and home appliances. Now, even before retaliation is in place, U.S. exporters will lose sales, as we did in the trucking dispute with Mexico. America's exporters need Congress to act now to prevent the loss of potentially billions in exports, not months into the future. The NAM's primary objective as a co-chair of the Cool Reform Coalition has always been to avoid retaliation by Canada and Mexico, and to prevent the loss of export sales by our nation's manufacturers. With the threat of retaliation looming for our nation's manufacturing, time has run out. The NAM and the Cool Reform Coalition urge Congress to bring the United States back into compliance with its WTO obligations and to do so fully and quickly. And I must add, Cool Reform is just one of a number of vital pieces of trade legislation moving through Congress that would boost the competitiveness of manufacturers in the United States, including Trade Promotion Authority, or TPA. It's critical that Congress finish the job on TPA. Accessing global markets, participating in the global economy on a more level playing field, and making sure everyone plays by the rules is critical for growing manufacturing in the United States. Last Friday, we saw that a majority of the House supports TPA, along with the majority of the Senate. What we need now is to get beyond procedural roadblocks and get the TPA to the President's desk. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Ken. So batting cleanup today. We've got Randy Russell, who has always dreamed of batting cleanup. Randy actually has an interesting array of experience on his bio here, so I thought I'd mention he's currently the president of an ag and consulting firm called the Russell Group. Before that, he worked as chief of staff for Secretary of Agriculture John Block. He's also had some other interesting private sector experience working with the Pillsbury Company. So, Randy?
Good morning. As a former collegiate baseball player, I always wanted to bat cleanups. Now is my opportunity. I never got that chance. I was usually batting 7th, 8th, or 9th. Thanks to the Global Business Dialogue for putting on this event this morning, and to Nick and the National Pork Producers for having me, and David, thanks for moderating this morning. I have a little bit different perspective on the whole cool debate, so if you can bear with me a little bit on a little history, but I think that's important. I have been involved in the cool debate since the early 2000s, and I've run 2 different coalitions representing U.S. livestock and meat interests. And if you go back to 2002, when the Farm Bill first put in mandatory country of origin labeling, I helped lead a coalition that for two consecutive year periods put off implementation of cool. Then we found ourselves in 2008. The Democrats had taken control of the House and Senate. Colin Peterson came to myself and came to Tom Bias, who then was president of the National Farmers Union, and asked us to negotiate some changes to the underlying 2002 law. It was very obvious with the Democrats in control of the House and Senate that we were going to have cool, but we were going to try to come up with a package to lessen some of the economic impacts. So we did that. And those became law in 2008. Then, obviously, as been referred to here earlier, Secretary Vilsack and the Department promulgated a rule in May of 2013, and I'll talk about that in just one second. In 2002, in 2008, and in May of 2013, when the Department promulgated a rule, in each of those cases, we told the administration and we told the Congress that these solutions were going to have WTO problems, that they were not going to be WTO compliant. And of course, following the fact that the U.S. lost the cases, the Department promulgated a rule in May of 2013 that was more trade restrictive and more costly. Mexico and Canada have now challenged the United States through the WTO 4 times, and they have won 4 times, and the United States has lost. So with that as background, let me make 4 points on how I see this going forward. Number 1 is the economic costs of segregation. The heart and soul of the WTO cool case rests on the economic costs of segregation. The tracking of livestock from birth to slaughter, segregating livestock and meat, and managing the supply chain throughout the entire system to ensure compliance. This process places enormous costs on U.S. livestock producers, on U.S. meat processors, and disadvantages Canada and Mexico by devaluing their livestock that is exported to the United States. Thus, point number 1, compliance with the WTO rulings will require segregation and the economic costs affiliated with segregation to be addressed head-on. Point number 2, the burden of proof shifts to the United States. Once retaliatory levels are formally established, and as we've just heard, that's a matter of a few months away, and implemented, they will stay in effect until Canada, Mexico, and the WTO are all satisfied. Thus, the burden of proof shifts to the United States. This means cool isn't just a congressional matter, but also we must satisfy Canada, Mexico, and the WTO. Point number 3, and this is very important. There is no silver bullet. There is no magical solution. There is no third way. There doesn't appear to be any other option to resolve this case. Ultimately, the cost of segregation and the economics behind that must be directly addressed. Some have suggested up in Congress a North American label. A North American label that includes a U.S. origin option means continued segregation costs and thus remains WTO violative. A generic North American label has been suggested by some. Such a label confers no new information to consumers, nor meaningful information to consumers. In either case, neither approach resolves the WTO decisions. And finally, and very importantly, retaliation is a cool tax on U.S. goods. Once retaliation begins, it represents a tax on billions of dollars on U.S. products. This retaliation is simply a cool tax on dozens of products, both agriculture and non-agriculture, that we export to two of our largest and very best customers. And finally, and very importantly, in the first year of any cool tax, it will equal $9 to $10 billion because it goes retroactive back to May 2013 when the department proposed their rule to supposedly fix the problem. Given these 4 points, it's time for the Senate to follow the House's lead and bring the U.S. back into WTO compliance. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. So we're going to move into our question and answer session. I'd ask that you wait for the microphone and please identify yourself as well as your affiliation. We have folks on the webcast, so we want to be sure that everyone's aware of who's asking the question. We have a question down in front here. If there's a specific panelist that you'd like to direct your question to, please do so.
No, anybody in the panel. I'm Jim Berger from Washington Trade Daily. I don't understand how a generic North American origin label would not fix this problem. I guess to Kenneth, wasn't it the whole idea about NAFTA?
Well, I mean, I can take that first part of the question, if you will. Essentially, the problem we see is that in the past there's been proposals both in discussions with the U.S. Congress and with the U.S. administration on different alternatives to try to resolve this, both on the regulatory side. And the problem is that many of the alternatives, including the ones that were just mentioned, do not eliminate the segregation that exists. We have the problem in having coexisting labels in a market in which one label will be favored, or there will be the possibility that the segregation will remain. That would not satisfy Mexico, and I believe it would not satisfy Canada as well. That's why we believe that the cleanest way and the only way to resolve this at this time would be a repeal. And it would get us back to the way we have always operated between Mexico and the U.S. You have a substantial transformation rule of origin in the NAFTA. You have live cattle that crosses, and then it's transformed into meat products, and that is a different product. It's a product, if you want to call it a product from the U.S. A piece of ribeye is no longer a live cattle. That is just intuitively obvious, but the case here is that that is the type of scenario that we should get back to, that there is no particular discrimination or devaluing of the product as it crosses the border from Mexico or from Canada into the U.S., and that is why repeal is the only option.
Other down here in front, please.
Thank you. I'm Greg Rushford. I publish the Rushford Report. As one who hasn't followed this closely, has anybody in the U.S. who pushed this idea originally been benefiting, and are they really happy? And I mean, why do they want this?
John, do you have some sense?
Yeah, I think if you go back originally, what this was about sort of fringe agriculture groups seeing a way to prevent imports of livestock from Canada and Mexico. And I think as it evolved, Randy talked about sort of the history, the legislative history. As it evolved, I think more folks saw that this was bad policy for the United States. U.S. processing facilities, U.S. feedlots, depending where they are geographically, depend on these animals coming in. So we're successful over a number of years at preventing this from being implemented. Then I think along came some various issues related to food safety, this or those, and those were seen as largely political cover. You know, when things happen, people say, we got to do something. What can we do? And this cool idea was there. It was low-hanging fruit to be able to say, well, if consumers want information, that was basically the excuse that was given. It never had that intent. It's not a food safety issue. Any food in a U.S. grocery store has been through, the USDA federal inspected system. It shouldn't be up to consumers to decide what is the safe food in the grocery store and what is the unsafe food. It doesn't work that way. This is a marketing initiative. So really, we think whatever the reasons were, they're all ill-conceived. This is ultimately bad policy for the U.S. Industry, as well as bad policy for those of us in Canada and Mexico that are selling livestock into the U.S., and it needs to go away.
Okay, I have a question from the webcast. I'm sorry?
I still don't know, who are you fighting? Who wants to keep this?
Well, all I know is who can resolve it. The Congress can resolve it, and I think if you look at our retaliation list, we've identified certain areas that have been problematic in terms of areas. We look at certain states. We've looked at certain areas, and we've picked products from those areas. So if you look at wine, for example, we've seen in California, there have not been senators that have been particularly helpful. There have not been senators that have been particularly helpful in certain, northern Midwest states, and you'll see products on that retaliation list from those areas.
We have a call-in question from Ken Morgan of the Interstate Farm Network, and Ken's question is that we please confirm that COOL repeal only impacts cattle, hogs, and poultry, and will have no effect on the regulations for sheep, fish, and other products. And that's correct. The COOL dispute itself really relates only to pork, beef, and chicken is thrown in. So the repeal currently being considered would only cover those products. There'd be no impact at all on the other products that Ken mentioned, sheep, fish, etc. In the back of the room, please. There's a...
Hi, thank you. I'm Victoria Guida with Politico. A lot of opponents to the free trade agenda have sort of pointed to the COOL case as proof that trade deals overturn regulations that are directed at giving consumers more information. And obviously, while the WTO didn't directly overturn this law and can't, you all have said that basically the only option is repeal. So my question is, are they really wrong?
I'd be happy to take that.
It's Randy Russell speaking.
So if someone wants to voluntarily label their meat as U.S. origin, there is a process to do that within USDA, and that has been in place and continues. The issue here is how the United States chose to implement its COOL provision and the high cost associated with segregation. When you have to, under the rule the department promulgated in May of 2013, you have to track where a feeder pig is born, when it crosses the border, what facility it goes into, where it is processed, where it is held in a cooler, where it is shipped, and that puts enormous costs not only on the U.S. but also devalues the value of that feeder pig coming out of Canada. The same with feeder cattle coming out of Mexico. I think it's important to point out, too, that after NAFTA, we basically encouraged within North America the development of a North American livestock and meat business. And then we turn around and implement a restrictive COOL provision that devalues livestock coming across the border from both Canada and Mexico, which directly undercuts that integration of a North American system. So I think it is how we have implemented COOL, not COOL in and of itself, that is really the heart of the WTO case.
If I may actually just
Please.
kind of take a slightly different tack on the question, really looking at the broader systemic concerns and the importance for international leadership for the United States in terms of meeting its international obligations that it has voluntarily undertaken and created as a founding member of the WTO. It is very much in the long-term interest of the United States to live by the rules of the international trading system and ensure that other countries do the same. And so this is very much a part of that. And important systemically for the U.S. that we adhere to our obligations, particularly where 4 times, not just once, as I communicated earlier, the U.S. has been found to be out of compliance. And so I think that's an important piece here just of the U.S. as a rules player, playing by the international rules of the game, that it's important that we do so, just to add.
Yeah, I would emphasize from a legal perspective, there's nothing in any of the WTO opinions that questions the legal right of the United States to provide origin information to consumers. In fact, the opinions state the opposite. The question is whether we're providing usable, rational information that justifies the costs that we're imposing on the production and distribution chain. We have another webcast question for Ken, which is, could you please explain why Mexico increased its retaliation request? And then a second question of how Canada and Mexico have determined the retaliation levels.
Well, since you may understand that this is an issue that's still in litigation being presented at the WTO, so the details of our presentation of our number will be discussed in the context of the WTO process. What I can tell you is that in looking at this amount of $713 million, that allows us to take a look specifically at what kind of products could be affected and what would be the range of impact across these products. We have mentioned in the past, even though we have not published a list as thorough as Canada has, but we have mentioned that Mexico will be in a position to impose trade sanctions to suspend benefits across a wide variety of sectors. And these include some of the sectors that have been mentioned as being in our list on trucking. That is a good point where to start looking at this issue. Includes fruits and vegetables, juices, meat products, wine and beverages, dairy products, machinery, furniture and appliances, office equipment as well as a possibility, as well as chocolate and others. We will come up with a list definitively shortly, but this gives you an idea of the kinds of products and the kind of retaliation that we've implemented in the past. We are also working on making this list strategic in the sense of attending to the needs that we see where pressure can be exerted to generate change in the legislation. So those are issues that we're taking into consideration. And now that we have this final number, we can come up with this final list.
I think I omitted the asker of the question. It was Jackie Fatka from Feedstuffs. John, do you want to add anything from Canada's perspective?
I think in terms of how we came up with the number, there's Ken certainly hit the nail that we're going to present the analysis to the WTO, to the arbitration panel. So I'm not going to go into too many details right here, but I think it's fair to say that there's various elements of it that we looked at. One part of it was what is the effect on the price discount on feeder cattle that we export to U.S. feedlots? What is the impact on finished cattle that we export to U.S. processing facilities? Similar calculations on the hog side. We looked at what is the price suppression effect on the price of those animals in Canada, because we know that the price in Canada is basically set off of the price in the U.S. The U.S. is a much larger market. So if there's a discounted, depressed price in the U.S., Canadian buyers are aware of that. And the equilibrium in the marketplace results in there being a price depression on both sides. So part of it is even on cattle that we don't export, we still see the impact of cool in the domestic Canadian marketplace, and that's all going to be factored into the analysis.
Let me slip in another question from the webcast because it's related to your point, John. The question comes from Terry Simmons from AgWatch, which is how much money are Canada and Mexico losing annually because of cool labeling? John?
Well, that's basically what our number that we're seeking damages for. It's slightly over 3 billion Canadian dollars. Prior to USDA revising the rule, In 2013, we had a number which was slightly over, I think it was about $1.1 billion for cattle and hogs together. But because they made it much more costly, switching from basically from a country of origin labeling program to a point of production labeling program, they increased the amount of segregation and the price discounts. So that's how we've gone from that earlier number to the higher number.
Ken?
The same applies to us. Is essentially you have to look at this number that we presented in the WTO, 713 million, as the impact that this is having on our trade with the United States. We have traditionally gradually been increasing our exports to the United States, and the fact that our product is being devalued, there is a substantial cost per head discount coming into the United States, in addition to the fact that many plants, especially in the across the southern border, are now preferring not to have to segregate at all and just buy domestic. So this becomes a kind of buy American provision where, you know, the meat processors are much better off just purchasing the domestic product and leaving the foreign product, that is Mexican live cattle, out of their processing facilities. So those are the costs that we are incurring.
Please. Please wait for the mic. Thank you.
Jerry Hagstrom from the Hagstrom Report. I have two questions. The first is, if the cattle and hogs come in from Mexico and Canada more easily, do you expect the prices of cattle and hogs or the meat produced from them to go down in the United States? And secondly, what do you think is the impact of the House deciding to add chicken and the ground meat provisions that were not required by the WTO to the prospects for your repeal?
Well, I think on the first one, we would see an immediate price improvement for Canadian cattle. Because essentially what we're doing is we're talking about taking costs out of the system. Those same costs don't apply to U.S. livestock that those buyers are buying. So it's a cost that is focused only on the imported livestock, and that's what the WTO found, that it had created that discrimination. So eliminating that, we expect to see that immediately positive, and without passing the cost along to consumers. It's really just taking the cost out of the system, so we think it will be very positive. I might let one of the panelists talk about the impact of the U.S. legislation.
In our case, we see it along the same lines. We don't see a negative impact likely on prices at all. As a matter of fact, there is the fact that we've had this integration throughout decades now reflects the fact that the demand for beef products in the U.S. has kept rising, and from the Mexican perspective, we've been able to supply the live cattle necessary not only for domestic consumption in the U.S., but as we said, to export to third markets. In fact, we import beef products from the United States that come from this integrated process. So if anything, it will liberate the ability of the restraints that have been established in the system through the cool labeling. By taking it away, will free up the opportunity to continue growing the sector. We think those are the benefits that we would bring from getting back to a mechanism of free trade between our countries, and I think the same applies in the case of Canada.
Randy, any additional thoughts on the legislation?
Well, Jerry, I was just going to make a comment that, you know, this legislation has been in effect since 2002, and the cases have been around since after the 2008 Farm Bill was put into effect. If there is a third way or a silver bullet, so to speak, to resolve this issue, it's a little perplexing to me why it hasn't surfaced before. The fact is, as I stated earlier, Canada and Mexico have brought two different cases against the United States. We've lost both of them. They appealed. We appealed both of them. We lost both of them. So we can talk about the economic costs that have occurred since these rules have gone into effect. I think we also need to spend a little bit of time, though, talking about the economic costs that are going to occur if we don't come into WTO compliance. And I just want to reiterate, we are talking about a cool tax bill on U.S. products, both ag and non-ag, that will be about $10 billion the first year if they go into effect. Now, you talk to people on Capitol Hill, and they say there is a third way. These aren't going to occur anytime soon, so we've got plenty of time to act. Well, I think we just heard this morning that there isn't much time, and the time to act is upon us. So I think, Congress needs to step in and take action, or we're going to be facing a situation where people are going to be held accountable for why is there a $10 billion tax being put into effect because we are out of compliance with the WTO.
If I could just add to that, from a manufacturing perspective, really from an exporting perspective, even before retaliation is in place, the effects of lost sales will be felt. It happened with the cross-border dispute with Mexico. Agree with everything Randy said in terms of the tax and the cost of this, but also, we have a list from Canada. We have a list of actual products that they're, or at least a product list that they may use as the basis of their retaliation. So, the impact is going to be felt now and not necessarily just in a few months or whenever, if and when Canada and Mexico retaliate. So decisions are made far in advance. This is a global supply chain. These are, sources for our exports, agriculture, manufacturing exports. And so really, it's just to really underscore that point that we need to move now, not some date in the future or that there's borrowed time here. I mean, we've heard some things to that effect that, there's time to sort this out and figure it out. I mean, as Randy said, there's been a number of years we've been looking at this and trying to find different solutions, and the time is now. So there's not a long window here or a long tail for us to act on cool and get this right.
Please, back.
Thank you. Sean Marie Giroux with Trade Moves. My question really is for Ken Smith. It goes to the point that 2 years ago, Canada proposed its retaliation list and gave a lot of transparency. And as Mr. Masswohl said, it was to put some pressure on Congress in certain targeted areas. And Mexico's taken a different approach. And in the NAFTA trucking dispute, if I recall correctly, the list came out and then implementation was soon thereafter, if not the next day. And so it's a very different approach on how you're looking at your proposed retaliation list. You said it would come out shortly. I'd like to hear what that means. Does that mean after June 17th? Do you expect to publish a list? That would be very interesting to know. And the fact that it's based on the NAFTA trucking dispute is very helpful. I think that gives a little bit more insight for businesses. But I also see it converging with the fact that we have a lot of other trade disputes or trade issues with Mexico that aren't resolved. We've got the anti-dumping countervailing duty case on sugar. That's happened this past year and a half. We see changes to the proposed changes to the IMEX program, which could happen in the very near future. And we now have the proposed retaliation list from Mexico. So just wanted to hear your thoughts about sort of the convergence of all these issues and the timing coming up this summer. And then also I wanted to ask about Mr. Russell's point about possible retroactive application of duties back to May 2013, and if this is something that you anticipate Mexico and if the colleagues from Canada would also speak that indeed Canada would ask for the same at the WTO arbitration panels this summer. Thank you.
Ken?
Well, thank you very much for your question. I think that I'll take the first issue regarding the list. What we have been trying to communicate both to the U.S. administration, to the U.S. private sector, and of course in the visits that we make to the Hill is the fact that we have indeed acted on a retaliation front before. We give the example, as you mentioned, of the trucking dispute, of the Byrd Amendment. We present that list. Obviously, when we put together our list, we have to ensure that these are products that precisely because of the degree of integration that exists between Mexico and the U.S., we don't wind up hurting production processes in Mexico by affecting certain inputs, etc. So the work is very detailed. It has to be very precise in terms of the impact that it has in Mexico, but also the intended impact in the United States. So when we have meetings at a high level with our ambassador, with our high-level officials from the Ministry of Economia on the Hill, we have discussed, for example, in the key states that have a stake in the game, focusing, for example, on the Committee of Agriculture in the U.S. Senate, we communicate to the legislators the importance of looking at the top 10 list for their states that they export to Mexico as potential candidates of being on a list. This is just something natural that comes from the fact that there is such a vibrant trade across all 50 states of the United States. Of course, we want to avoid getting to that point, and the message is, let's act now to try to resolve it. So that has been our strategy, and that will be the strategy going forward. And I don't have a specific date for a list coming out specifically because we have to do all this analysis that I mentioned, but it is something that in terms of the intended impact, we're working actively in the United States to convey the urgency to do so. Now, you also touched upon other issues which are important. I think it's worth mentioning. I mentioned at the beginning that the trade relationship in the agricultural sector between Mexico and the U.S. is very vibrant. It's $40 billion, and it's very beneficial and balanced in terms of the trade balance to both sides. But we do have disputes. That is just a fact, and I think worldwide you can look at the agricultural sector as one that will have disputes every once in a while and that are complex. You mentioned the case of sugar. In fact, there we have resolved the dispute to the degree that we have suspension agreements in place, and we hope that will continue to be so and eventually to get back to a regime of free trade, which is our final objective. You mentioned others as well, but I will mention one that has to do with the WTO and that will come in the next few months also, which is the tuna dispute. We've also in the verge of getting the final determination of the WTO in favor of Mexico. So that's something that has and can have a compound effect when you look at when we will be able to retaliate on that front. They're not exactly aligned, of course, with the case on coal, but this is something that will add to the mix, if you will. Overall, we have a very successful trade relationship on the agricultural front, and we want essentially to get rid of these disputes, to use the system, the multilateral system and the NAFTA system for dispute resolution precisely to get back to a mechanism where we can allow our exporters, our producers to benefit from free trade.
Okay.
Oh, we're still looking into that.
Randy, I believe there was an element to that question for you as well.
To be honest, I don't think I have anything else to add other than, the fact is, I think, I just want to, again, I think a lot of this focus on the historic side, I think what we really need to do is focus looking forward. I think it was significant that the House of Representatives voted 300 to 131 to repeal. I think it was significant that 66 Democrats voted for that, very bipartisan vote. And I think the day of reckoning is coming upon us here in terms of coming back into compliance.
I just think in terms of the various elements of how it's crafted, whether it's retroactive or carousel or various things, I think it's safe to say that we're going to craft it in a way to have the maximum effect. Details to come.
Question down in front on the left side.
In skimming the WTO panel...
I'm sorry, just please identify yourself first.
Bonnie Van Blarkum, Library of Congress.
Thanks.
In skimming the WTO panel and appellate reports, it appears that the labeling of origin for food products is valid conceptually with WTO rules, and it appears that in practice, non-discrimination means not cost-effective. We hear from the Russell Group that since 2002, no one's come up with a way that there could be a cost-effective way for pork and cattle, beef labeling. So from a WTO perspective, could it be a consumer versus producer issue? I understand the U.S. pork industry, 2% of its input is imported, where 30% is exported. So they're interested, I think, to have harmonization of rules globally so their exports aren't affected. So how can we resolve the consumer-producer aspect of this?
Randy, do you want to take a stab at that to start?
without getting too much into the weeds, under most trade rules, we use a term known as substantial transformation. And when a product is substantially transformed in a country, that is the country of origin. Now, all of a sudden, for U.S. livestock and meat interests, that has changed. If you take a live animal and slaughter it in the United States, I would say that's substantial transformation of that product. And under any other product, under any other rules, the country of origin would be that from which substantial transformation occurred, which would be in this case in the United States. But that is not the case under these cool rules. This is really not about consumer right to know or consumers versus producers. It is about, when you read the WTO cases and the appellate decisions, it is about the economic costs affiliated with segregation. And if you look at the rule that USDA proposed in May of 2013, it took us right back to where we were under the provisions of the 2002 Farm Bill, which had the highest economic costs and the most economic disruptions, because you had to track the animal from where it was born, and then once it came across the border, you had to track it all the way through the system, born, raised, and slaughtered. In 2008, the Farm Bill provision was also found to be trade violative, but it didn't have quite as severe of a tracking system as it did with the May 2013 rule. I mean, I must admit, I was perplexed by the USDA rule, thinking that they were going to find that in WTO compliance when the 2008 Farm Bill provision was found to be out of compliance.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, this is David Bond, that first of all, the WTO has never found that there was an issue or a concern with respect to origin labeling. I mean, they expressly recognize that that's a legitimate objective for any country in terms of implementing regulations. The problem is the way that we're doing it. And on many of the products that Randy mentions, where labels are based, the origin information is based on a substantial transformation test, we haven't seen any issues. There are no WTO cases or complaints that relate to those products. It's not because people have questions about whether or not origin should be discussed or conveyed. The point with respect to those other products is the information is rational that's being conveyed and doesn't clog up the distribution and production chain in a way that harms foreign producers' ability to sell in the United States. Ken or John, did you want to add to?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to make a similar point, just that we never actually did challenge the concept of country of origin labeling. And even if you look at all of the products that are covered by the Cool Law, the case was about discrimination of imported livestock, as opposed to, you know, Canada sells potatoes to the United States, and Cool applies to potatoes, but you plant the potato seed, you take the potato out of the ground, and you sell the potato. There isn't that substantial transformation that takes place, and even the way the law is put together, if other products that are covered are further processed in the United States, they're no longer subject to Cool. So the livestock is unique in that sense in this law, in that it says, okay, even if you import livestock to the United States and change it into a commercially different product, which is meat, you still have to track it, and therein lies the problem. So even before Cool, the United States had country of origin labeling. There's voluntary programs, and if people in the business wanted to label, if consumers found value in that origin information, you would think that people that are in the business are in the business of providing consumers with things that they value, and some companies were doing that. You know, some small regional meat companies were doing that, and there was a voluntary program and rules that USDA had that they had to follow. So without, you know, once this Cool Law is repealed, if that should be what happens, then they will revert back to the voluntary program that's been in place long predating Cool.
Anyone else?
Thank you very much. I'm Joanne Thornton. I'm with Policy Connections International, and a big fan of the Global Business Dialogue. Thanks for this meeting today. And I have a question, actually, David, for you. I think I heard you say in your opening remarks that one possible scenario would be more litigation at the WTO, that the United States perhaps would pursue yet another case at the WTO against the retaliatory measures taken by Canada and Mexico. And I don't understand if Canada and Mexico's proposed measures pass muster with an arbitration panel, what's the rationale for further litigation? How would we bring a case? Thanks.
So the phase of the WTO litigation that addresses the question of whether COOL is okay or not is over. The appellate body decision in May resolves or decides that COOL, the amended COOL measure, is not WTO consistent, period. There will be no further discussion of that point. The only discussion that's going on now relates to how much retaliation Mexico and Canada are entitled to. Once they receive authorization to retaliate at whatever level it is, they will be entitled to keep that retaliation in place until they're happy. So if they are pleased with whatever Congress ultimately does, they may choose to stop their retaliation, in which case it will go away. But if Congress takes some action that Mexico and Canada don't believe is adequate, the only way that the United States will have to stop them from retaliating will be to go and to bring their own independent WTO case challenging the continued suspension of the concessions, the continued retaliation against the United States. There's a great example of this where following the WTO litigation with respect to U.S. exports of beef with hormones to the EU took certain steps to make changes that it claimed brought them into compliance with the appellate body rulings. The U.S. said, no, we don't think so. We're going to leave our retaliation in place. So the EU was forced to then go back and to initiate their own dispute to try to have the retaliation stopped. So that's the real risk here, and that's why I think several of us have said that Congress doesn't really have the luxury of doing a half sort of fix here. They need to get it right, because unless we want retaliation to stay in place for years while the U.S. goes and litigates this, the fix needs to be sufficient to make Mexico and Canada happy so that they will, on their own, stop retaliating. Down in front, please.
Yeah, thanks again. Jim Berger from Washington Trade Daily. Just so I can understand this, for safety reasons, does the Department of Agriculture require that they know where the origin of cattle come from, where they were born, where they were raised, and where they're slaughtered? Or do they wait till a problem arises?
You raise an interesting question here, because I feel that there's quite a bit of misinformation out there regarding the actual impact of country of origin labeling in terms of informing consumers and what did they inform them about. And I think that the issue you mentioned is important, because many times in the debate of people who feel that they would be in favor of COOL per se, equated with some sort of a safety or quality issue having to do with the products coming into the United States, and that is not the case at all. Mexico, Canada, any other country in the world that exports into the U.S. cannot export agricultural, whether it's fruits and vegetables or meat products, that do not comply with the United States safety requirements. And for each product, you have specific protocols and testing and risk analysis that goes into effect. So regardless of the fact that we have no tariffs between our countries, regardless of the fact that we have an environment of free trade, our products can only come in, and it is the same for U.S. products going into Mexico if you are complying with food safety regulations. So saying that you're in favor of COOL because the consumers have a right to have safe food is the wrong argument. This has nothing to do with food safety in particular. And of course, answering your question, there are specific protocols between the food safety agencies of both of our countries and between the U.S. and Canada as well that guarantee that products coming into the U.S. comply with safety regulations. But it has nothing to do with COOL.
So COOL is requiring a double test?
Well, it's not related specifically to food safety, but what it tries to do is provide information to the consumer. And Mexico, just echoing what John was saying, Mexico is not opposed to providing consumer information. We do it in Mexico as well. It is the way it is implemented that generates the distortions that have been presented, and therefore the impact on trade.